Hi, I'm Newman Burdett. I am on the intellectual leadership team for RISE, and I'm an educational assessment expert working on how assessment and examination systems work in national education systems. We're going to be looking at educational assessment through this series of talks, but more specifically, how educational system assessment works and how assessment is an integral part of education. We're going to start with this session just by going through some of the key issues, and then we will address those issues and some of those points in more depth in other sessions. First of all, let's just start with why are we discussing assessment as part of the education system? There's been a lot of antagonism towards examinations, testing, etc., a lot of which comes out of historical tensions where, especially in America, it was felt that examinations were destroying education. So why are we thinking about assessment as being important for education? And hopefully by the end of this, we'll have made the case that it is. And one of the phrases that came through on that was weighing a pig doesn't make it grow any faster, or doesn't make it any grow fatter. So the idea of assessing students doesn't improve outcomes. But it is true that it doesn't directly make any difference. But if we want to know how healthy the system is, if we want to know whether students are learning, whether learning is improving, are outcomes getting better, are outcomes equitable, we need to have good data on those learning outcomes and the various parameters around the education system so that we can make informed decisions. And there's a couple of quotes there from Arthur Conan Doyle, just really to drive home the point that without good data, you can't make informed decisions. You cannot actually know where you are or whether you're going to hit your goals or what is wrong. And the images here are actually just showing scientists measuring various animals, because without that measurement, you don't know how healthy the system is, and you do not know what needs to be done to correct it and whether that corrections are being effective. So let's just start with some of the basics. What do we want to assess? And to do that, we really have to go back to a fundamental question: what do we mean by learning? When we're talking about measuring learning, what do we mean by it? Do we mean the SDG 4 indicators, so specifically minimum proficiencies in reading and mathematics, or ability in ICT skills, or some of those other measurements within SDG 4? Or, as a lot of people seem to be talking about when they're talking about curriculum changes, is 21st century skills or those other higher order skills? And if you're working in LMI countries or in trying to improve systems, it's probably around those. But you do need to be aware that what is actually being measured in some of the data might not be those. So if you're looking at exam results, are they measuring those, or are they measuring more properly something like how much of the curriculum is being covered, or how much tutoring and rote learning is going on within that school system? So you just need to be aware that what the data you get might reflect different aspects of what is perceived as learning. The other question is, who do we actually measure? And this very much depends on the answers we want and the inferences we want to draw from it. So is it a census assessment or a sampled assessment? And by that I mean, do we measure all the learners, or do we just measure a very carefully selected sample so that we don't have to measure everyone, but we will get a representative view of how the population as a whole behaves just from a smaller sample? Are we only interested in the learners in school, or are we interested in all learners, whether or not they're in school or whether they're in different types of school? Are we interested to see the impact of education in different school systems or different interventions? So, if it's a public-run school, or a publicly funded school, or private schools, or religious schools, all these different questions. You have to think about that to make sure that the data you get will give you that granularity to be able to answer those questions. Do we want to measure students at a particular age or at a particular stage? So do we want to do it, say, all children by the age of 8 have basic numeracy and literacy, or is it all children who've had this many years in school, etc.? And again, it comes back to how much granularity we need. How much data do we need? How much accuracy in that data do we need to do to be able to sort of pick out and differentiate these different questions? Do we need to cover the whole of the ability range of learners, which can be huge? So in something like maths, you know, between a student who is not capable of even basic numeracy or a student who can actually do very higher order mathematics, you know, the range between those on a scale is almost impossible to measure. Do we want to have particular discrimination around learners at certain points in the data? So if we are interested in, you know, basic proficiency in reading and maths, do we really want to focus our measurement instruments around there so we get very good, accurate data at that point in the distribution? And as I said before, you know, do we need to differentiate different cohorts of learners within that data? So do we need to have more data points around that so we can safely do that? So there's a lot of questions we need to start asking ourselves before we even come on to, you know, the other basics of assessment. Where do we actually get our data from? Again, it depends on the answers we want and the inferences we want to draw from that data. But it will also depend on what data is available and or what access we have to be able to get that data. So if we can only get access to some schools, then that's where we will get our data from. I've listed a whole range of different data there, so sort of national achievement surveys, examination data, big surveys like PISA and TIMSS, and we'll come back onto those, so I'm not going to spend much time on them in this session. But the questions we always have to ask ourselves is the data any good? And again, we'll come back onto what makes good data, what makes good assessments. And then, is bad data better than no data? If you've got a data set with big variation in, but it still allows you to say that actually basic proficiency has changed, that is probably better than having nothing at all. But if you've got data that is actively misleading, that might not be better than having no data at all. There's another couple of questions there as well. How old is the data? Recently, I was having to do a review of a country's education system and whether some changes had been effective. But all the data dated from pre the start of the intervention, so it was useless. How often is the data produced? So if you're looking at using sort of data from TIMSS or PISA or PEARLS or whatever, you know, they run on certain cycles. So will you actually have good data from that will give you data in a timely way to fit with your needs? And then the last point is really that assessment, and especially examinations, is a really intrinsic part of an education ecosystem. It is almost impossible to have a good education system without some form of assessment happening within that. It's not just an outcome measure of education. It's not just data. It's something that is very integral to education, and especially the education system. So you can't change the education system without impacting the assessment. And similarly, you can't change the assessment without impacting the education system, which makes it both a lever and a barrier to change. But again, we will come back onto that in later sessions to go back into more detail. So that's just a very brief introduction to assessment and why it's important. But we'll go back onto all the big issues in that through the other sessions and go into more detail. Thank you.